I feel like when I think of the last year, I have just been in full on physical science mode as I've been working on a revamp of each of those units. And if you're listening to this podcast episode right now, all 5 of the intro to physics units in my physical science curriculum are officially done and revamped. I'm working on the intro to chemistry units, starting with matter right now. So those are in the works. But because of all of that, I haven't really thought of my first love, if you will, which is biology, in what seems like a long time. So it felt like a good time to pause and remember her. Yes, I am personifying this because the biology curriculum was my first It's Not Rocket Science baby. I originally wrote it in 2016. I started writing the biology curriculum the day essentially that we started trying to get pregnant. That ended up taking a couple years. By the time we adopted our oldest and gave birth to our second, who is biological, there were 3 It's Not Rocket Science curriculums. So it was like in a short 4-year period, we birthed 3 It's Not Rocket Science curriculums and added 2 human children to my family. It was insane. And if you haven't been listening to me on social media gab about this, January 1st was 10 years of It's Not Rocket Science, which is really exciting. But all that to say, biology was first. It was the first of all the It's Not Rocket Science full year curricula, and that was 2016, but I revamped it in 2020. Because by 2020, I had then at that point written physical science, its first iteration, and anatomy. I felt like I got a lot better at curriculum writing, and I just knew how to write things up better. So I revamped it then, just like I'm doing the physical science one now. So the reason I'm excited to do this episode is twofold. One, I just want to talk about biology because I feel like I haven't been able to think or talk about it in a really long time, and I miss it. And 2, I really want to share how I chose my sequence for my biology curriculum and why I have chosen to arrange it and prioritize what I prioritize. I think the order matters so much for biology, especially if you are in a school or a district or a state that has a high stakes end of course exam for biology, which many, many states and districts and schools do. Then your sequence really, really matters because how you're choosing to scaffold and really build your students' knowledge and understanding of biology and those skills and concepts, it really makes a difference in terms of what success they will see at the end of the year when they take that EOC exam. So I did an episode like this back in November, episode 209, about my anatomy scope and sequence, and it was pretty well received even by those of you who are not anatomy teachers. So if you teach anatomy or any elective science, highly recommend going back and listening to that. But I'm hoping that this episode will be informative for so many of you listening. If you teach biology at all, if you think you might be teaching biology in the future, if you teach a course with a high stakes end of course exam, I think maybe hearing my thought process for how I've arranged this sequence might help you think of yours. And then definitely this will be helpful if you do use It's Not Rocket Science biology curriculum or are considering using my It's Not Rocket Science biology curriculum, which by the way, at the time of this recording has over 650 5-star reviews on TBT, which is just so exciting. Because again, I started doing this a decade ago and it's just wild to see what it has turned into. And I'm just so incredibly grateful. But all that to say, I'm done gabbing, I'm done gushing, and let's just get into it. Let's get into my biology scope and sequence, how and why I teach biology the way that I do. This is Secondary Science Simplified, a podcast for secondary science teachers who want to engage their students and simplify their lives. I'm Rebecca Joyner from It's Not Rocket Science. As a high school science teacher turned curriculum writer, I am passionate about helping other science teachers love their jobs, serve their students, and do it all in only 40 hours a week. Are you ready to rock the time you spend in your classroom and actually have a life outside of it? You are in the right place, teacher friend. Let's get to today's episode. Okay, so here's how I'm going to structure this episode. First, I just want to share why I find biology so near and dear to my heart. And I want to share this because, one, I think the context is going to be helpful before I share some strong opinions about my sequence. And two, I know that some of you listening might be a chemistry person or a physics person, or a middle school person, and you're teaching this high school biology course for the first time, and it does not feel near and dear to your heart. So I kind of want to encourage you there. And then we're going to dive into 3 things that I learned that my students really need from teaching biology and so many sections of it over so many years, and how I've included those 3 things in the arrangement of my sequence and the writing of my full year curriculum. Then we'll really dive into the sequence and how I do it and my 3 hottest takes on your biology sequence if you're coming up with that. And then I'll end the episode like I did with the anatomy one with just a few things that make It's Not Rocket Science biology curriculum unique, in my opinion, that make it stand out if you are someone who's considering using it. Okay, so let's start with why I'm obsessed with biology and just this curriculum and the sequence that I've come up with. So it is the first course I ever taught, and I've always taught biology. I taught it student teaching. I taught it at a large public school. I taught it at a small private school. So I've had all these different derivations of it. It's been incredibly different learning environments. Those 3 schools were all so different. And every time I taught biology, I had at least 3 sections of it. So I've gotten a ton of reps with it with a lot of different students. It was definitely the highest concentration of a course that I ever taught. I've also had the opportunity to teach the CP or the college prep or the on-grade level version of biology and honors and AP. And even just teaching AP, y'all, that really transformed and really made me reevaluate and was a crucial part of my revamp in 2020 of how I approached the other levels below it. So I think being able to teach it on all those levels was really, really impactful for me. Again, like I said, I've taught it in so many different environments. One of those was a large public school. So we followed all the state mandates, which included a state mandated high stakes EOC course. And I had a 96% pass rate on that state EOC course for my CP students. Those are my non-honor students, my on-grade level students, and 100% pass rate for my honor students. And this was a South Carolina public school with over 50% of the students being below the poverty line. And my average EOC score was a 90% for my time that I was at that school. I say that to tell you, I got really passionate about making sure that I was teaching in an effective way, not just for students learning and understanding and individual growth, but also for their success on these kinds of exams. Because y'all know, a lot of times those things aren't the same. They should be, but they're not. So teaching them how to really learn and understand and love a subject versus how to do well on the test for it is not always the same. And so I had to get really efficient with making sure I was doing that. And then my favorite thing too that got to happen in biology is then when I moved to a small private school, that school was using the next generation science standards and it was not doing the state EOC exam. So that was when I really got opened up to the NGSS, but had the flexibility to really play with it and explore how I wanted to incorporate it and have fun with it without the pressure of a high stakes test. And I learned so much over the years that I got to kind of mess around with that. And it really led me again to redesigning my entire curriculum and incorporating that 3-dimensional nature of the NGSS, because to me, that is the best part of the NGSS. But at the same time, understanding the expectation that I had that I was teaching freshmen. I don't know about you, but biology has been for freshmen in every school I've ever taught in. So those students have a lot of room to grow, if you will, in their ability to conquer the skills and the nature of the NGSS. They have a lot of things that they need to learn how to do before they can really do the NGSS way well. So I feel like I'm really proud of the curriculum I've come up with because I think it does a great job of scaffolding this for students. The earlier units in my curriculum feel a little bit more traditional and just feel a little less NGSS. And then as the curriculum goes on, as you progress through the units, students get more and more independent. They get more and more inquiry. There's more autonomy. And then the learning style feels even more and more 3-dimensional. And then when you get to my extension mini units, which can be used anywhere throughout the curriculum, but I kind of added on for the end, they're perfect for that 2 to 3 weeks you might have after your state EOC when you're like, what am I supposed to do at this time? I have pathogens. I have homeostasis on a deeper level, which really is more like an intro to anatomy and getting them excited about that. And then I have plants. And those three are like the most advanced in their NGSS nature. And that's why they're so perfect for the end of the year as we've been developing this in our students. And every unit comes with an NGSS alignment guide to kind of show how all that's incorporated and give you ideas for phenomena. So if you're listening to this and you're like, I have a state EOC and I'm NGSS, you didn't have the ability that I had to kind of practice doing both separately because you're now doing both together and you're feeling really overwhelmed by storylines, phenomena, all of that. I did a series on this podcast, I believe it was last February, all about the NGSS and really kind of breaking it down, debunking it, if you will, and trying to just encourage you with how to do that. And so start with episode 179. That's the NGSS storylines and phenomena. And I'll kind of explain why I don't write my units in a storyline manner or just on one specific phenomena, because I think it's really critical that you actually pick things based on your students' interest. And instead, I give you a bunch of different ideas. So all of that to say, all of that context, that's my background in biology. Through all those different experiences that I was teaching in with all those different students, with all these different expectations on me, depending on the different school that I was in, I learned that these biology students need three things. First, they need structure. Like I said, every class I taught biology, it was nearly all freshmen with a handful of maybe 10th graders that hadn't taken biology at their first school, or oftentimes it would be a 10th grader who was an English language learner. And so the school had pushed biology to them for sophomore year so that they had a little bit more time to grow in their language proficiency before they took this EOC course. But in general, mainly freshmen. And like I said, most of these freshmen were coming into high school overwhelmed and underprepared and really lacking like just major foundational skills that would let them be successful in high school. And this is, again, it's not to slight middle school teachers at all. If you're listening, you're a middle school teacher, like God bless you. I think you are an amazing group of people. I could literally never. I did several years where I had a few sections of 8th grade science, but I got to teach physical science as a high school course to 8th graders. It was humbling. I'll say that. I'll get more into that in a future episode on physical science. But all of that to say, they just like have a hard time. And I don't know if it's just because of a lack of what's going on the lower levels, if there's too much to manage there, if it's pandemic stuff, if it's just hormonal stuff. But like freshmen are weird, freshmen are hard. They need a lot of support. And because of that inadequacy I kind of saw in a lot of my students, I just found I needed to teach a lot of basic skills to them. I couldn't just dive into the NGSS like head first. They needed to learn how to be organized, how to take notes, how to study, how to have discussions in class, how to ask questions, how to send an email and ask for help, how to manage a calendar and due dates, like just a lot of these skills. So I found that this theme of structure was so important. And that is one of the things I really prioritize in my curriculum is structure. That's why I'm obsessed with my packet strategy. It helps students so much. It's why I batch plan and I'm able to do my lesson plans for an entire unit at one time to give them those due dates in advance. And I've just found that when I organize my units all the same also. So every unit I have, I divide into 3 to 6 concepts. And then every concept has some sort of lecture notes. Now, this isn't because I'm obsessed with direct instruction, but I do think that students really like to have like a home base, if you will. And I found that if you don't take notes for a concept, then they'll be like, you never taught me this, even though you're like, that's what every instructional resource we use is teaching you these things. So I do like to have a set of notes, even if it's really short, even if we break it up and stretch it out over 5 or 6 days, because we're doing all these different supplemental resources, inquiry activities, labs, etc. Okay, so every unit though has that. And I think they really appreciate that structure and that constancy and that rhythm. Again, it's kind of like their home base. They know they can fall back on having that. So giving that structure I found to be incredibly helpful and definitely a lot of reinforcing practice. There is more reinforcing practice in my biology curriculum than any of my others. I mean, physical science might be matched, but definitely more than anatomy and chemistry because those are for more upper level students. The second thing I saw that my students really, really needed was experiences. I discovered that all of the things my graduate professors were preaching about inquiry-based instruction was true. And it did make a difference. When my students engaged with the content and explored it and experienced it prior to having direct explanation of it, they were able to understand it so much better. They could tie in the content that we were learning to a specific memory or experience that they had in class. And it made it a lot easier for their long-term connections in their brains and for them to be able to really understand and know biology, which again, it builds on itself so incredibly much. If you feel overwhelmed, nervous, intimidated, tired when you hear the word inquiry-based instruction, I want you to listen to episode 194. It's from last August. It's some practical tips for inquiry-based learning that are just super simple to implement so you don't have to feel overwhelmed. And the other thing I want to encourage you with is students don't need a lot of materials to have these experiences. I spent several years teaching in a non-lab space, and so I have tons of labs and activities in my biology curriculum that do not require a lab. The only one that is tricky without a lab is the Ecosystem in a Bottle project, and that's a long-term investigation. It takes about a month to do it, but I still made it work in my Carpe Day classroom, and you can too. So I just want you to know that that is not a prerequisite. Having a lab space is not a prerequisite to being able to give your biology students the hands-on experiences they need to really understand this content. And now the third thing that I found that the students really, really need are the connections. Like, not only do I want my students to connect everything they're learning in our classroom to specific experiences we're having in our classroom, like labs and demos and simulations and projects and discussions, but they also need to be able to make connections between the units. Every single topic in biology is linked to the others. None of them can really be taught in isolation without mentioning something from something else. And this is why there's a lot of variety in terms of how people choose to structure the sequence of their biology courses, because there is no true one perfect way to do it, because again, all of the content overlaps. And in just a minute, I'm just going to share mine though. But I tell you this because I think one of the reasons my students were so successful on their EOCs is because every single one of my tests had a cumulative section. So back to what I was saying about dividing the unit into concepts. All of my It's Not Rocket Science units are split into 3 to 6 concepts. On my biology tests, and this is unique to biology, I didn't do this for all the others, but I did it because biology, like I said, was an EOC course. I actually broke the test down, the test questions, into concepts. So it'd be like the concept 1 questions, concept 2, concept 3, and then a cumulative section, which would have questions related to content from previous tests. Now, you might be saying, how did you do that if you're saying it all builds on each other? Well, it is tricky, but I did my best to split it into those concepts. And the reason I love doing that is because it helps so much with data analysis to look back and say, okay, you did great on all of the cells content. You just bombed the cumulative section, which tells me, we're not doing a good enough job reviewing and bringing in the previous content into this, so we need to do that more. Or you did excellent on mitosis and cancer, excellent on cell theory and organelles, but you totally did not get concept 2 cell transport. And so I know that that is where I need to remediate, or that's where if the whole class struggled, okay, whatever instructional resources I was using were not getting the point across for cellular transport. And now we reevaluate. And this is the process. I tell you all this, y'all, because this is the process I used to come up with my sequence I'm about to share with you. The reason it's arranged the way it is because so much trial and error of looking at the data, seeing these sections of the test that students didn't do well on, and figuring out what needed to change so that they could be more successful. And I really found that cumulative section and dividing the tests up by concept really worked to inform me of what was going on. All of that to say, this has led to my sequence, and here's how I do it. In general, I teach micro to macro, but here's the deal. I do mix some of the macro content in, and let me explain that. I know there's just so much debate about what is the best way to do it, but there's a lot of reasons I really like it this way. First and foremost, I love starting with macromolecules. This is my first of 3 hot takes. Macromolecules are essential. If you are spending the bare minimum on macromolecules because your students hate them, they find them boring, they always bomb that part of your biochem test, and then you're finding like they cannot remember them throughout the year, you're doing macromolecules wrong. Macromolecules should be exciting. We should do something fun for them to learn about macromolecules. That's why I do my Murder and Emil lab, which is free in my TPT store. It is a very hands-on lab. I did have to float to my chemistry teacher's classroom to use his lab space for this one, but it got them into macromolecules and it was a super memorable experience. But I love starting with macromolecules because, y'all, every single biology unit ties back to macromolecules. It is like The foundation of biology, everything goes back to a macromolecule. So I'm obsessed with starting with macromolecules. I do that in my very first unit. Like when we're talking about scientific inquiry and experimental design and a little chemistry background, we're talking about macromolecules in that unit. Like it's so important. It's in unit 1. And then we're going to build on that understanding throughout the year and move to macro. I like ending with ecology also when you go micro to macro for several reasons. First, ecology is so fun, but it is the easiest unit. It's the easiest for my students to understand. It's so fun. I have like a gajillion instructional resources in my ecology unit. I think my ecology unit's like 8 weeks long because of how many instructional resources I put in there. But that also means it's the easiest to cut short if you need to before the exam. If you get behind because of hurricane days or snow days or just general interruptions or things just go slower and all of a sudden it's the end of the year, and if you've left evolution for your last unit, that is such a disservice for your students for you to take evolution and squeeze it into 5 days. That's insane. Now, ecology, it would be very sad to squeeze it in 5 days, but you very much could because so much of it is going to be familiar from what they've learned in life science before. And it's just the easiest content of all biology. So why not start with the harder things when they're fresher, they're coming back from summer, their brains are a little bit sharper. Start there and then work our way towards macro. I feel so passionate about this. I also love ending the year with my last 2 units being evolution and ecology because those are both really activity-based for me. And so I think it keeps students really engaged when they have that spring fever and they're all having senior spring fever. They all wish they were graduating. And I'm like, come on, you're a freshman. Like, look alive, okay? It keeps them really, really engaged to the very last day. So the way my sequence works as an overview, again, we start with macromolecules and I call it biology basics is my first unit. Then we move into cells, energy flow, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and then genetics, and then we hit winter break. We come back from winter break into heredity, which I love. Genetics is like DNA replication, protein synthesis, meiosis. Then we come back in January and we kind of pick up and review that. And then we dive into heredity, which the students love. So I love how this falls because they're super interested in it. They love learning about how they are the way they are, genetic disorders, genetic engineering. It's all very interesting. So it's like the perfect thing to do in January, which is like the most dreary time of the year. And then we have evolution and ecology to wrap up our spring semester. Again, ecology is really easy to trim if you need to. So like I said, I have 3 key sequencing tips that I'm really, really passionate about. First, like I said, macromolecules at the very, very beginning. Second is that energy flow unit. This is when I do biochemical reactions. So we cover enzymes, adenosine triphosphate, so ATP. We cover photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And then, y'all, we cover food webs and trophic pyramids. I pulled that out of my ecology unit because, again, ecology was already so easy. And I saw on my test that they were struggling with these biochemical reactions. And so I brought in food webs and trophic pyramids so that they can learn the micro alongside of the macro. They can see how energy flows between these different populations in an ecosystem, but then they can also see how it flows within one individual through their cells and how that energy is processed. I cannot tell you how much it helps students for them to see those 2 things alongside each other. I'm so passionate about that, but not as passionate as I am about this. This is my 3rd key sequencing tip or hot take. Y'all, please, if you're teaching biology, do not teach mitosis and meiosis together. When students learn them together or learn them in sequence, first and foremost, they get prophase 1, prophase 2, they get all that confused. Second, they think the processes happen in sequence when they don't. They're happening in different cells at different times for different purposes. So why are we teaching them at the same time? It doesn't make any sense. Teach mitosis alongside cancer, uncontrolled cell growth in your cells unit. That cancer topic is going to make that so much more interesting and engaging for them. Then they're going to get mitosis. They're going to get PMAT. They're going to get interphase down pat. They're going to get that. And then a few months later, when I get to genetics, and again, we do DNA replication, then protein synthesis, then we get to meiosis, we're referring back to what we've learned in cells because we talk about DNA replication and we bring it back to S phase of interphase. So we're talking about that. Then we talk about protein synthesis. Then we get into meiosis, and I'm bringing it up, but in a totally separate context. And really in genetics, we're just kind of hitting the basics of meiosis. And then when we come back in January into our heredity unit and we start talking about inheritance patterns and pedigrees and genetic disorders, we're bringing up meiosis again, and they're getting it kind of a second time since it is more confusing than mitosis, in my opinion. So I find this works so much better for students if you teach those separate from each other and within the context in which they make the most sense because of when the processes are actually happening. Okay. I got so much more long-winded about that than I anticipated. You can tell I'm like extremely passionate about this. So I'm going to wrap this up with a few more things that I think make It's Not Rocket Science biology curriculum unique. I've already touched on some of these because I couldn't help it. I just get so excited. But like I said, I write my curriculum, all of it, for teachers who are in settings that have like little to no science budget and very little equipment. You can do all my labs and activities and have an incredibly hands-on learning experience for your students without a lab space and by buying a lot of the materials from Amazon or whatever. I have a spreadsheet that I made last year of all the supplies that are needed for every one of my curriculums and, curricula. Y'all know I'm a science person, not an English person, but I have all of those listed out. I have what's consumable, what's not consumable, what you would need from a chemical supply closet. Like I have those all organized. If you want any of those, reach out to me, DM me on Instagram or email me at Rebecca@itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com. I can get those to you. They're linked in all my bundle descriptions and in all of those as well. But you can see what I mean by how simple these resources are. Another thing is my curriculum and all of mine, you don't need a textbook. I use a bunch of different resources that students are going to gather information from, so you don't have to worry about like adopting a textbook or having the right one. You don't need it. The other thing I'm obsessed with is, like I said, alignment and connections. So not only are all the resources aligned to standards, but they're all aligned to each other. The units build upon each other. The scaffolding is so good and it helps them so much for their EOC. And y'all, you should never ever have someone in your class take a test and then say, you never taught me this. Because I make sure and I quadruple check that every single test question goes back to something on the cover page of their packet, which is what they make their study guides from. And then those things have been touched on in direct instruction and in instructional resources for reinforcement. So they are getting it in so many different avenues. And like I said, the connections. I'm always connecting big picture things to hard topics. So we're learning about cells. That's hard. They can't really picture them. So we're also going to talk about cancer so they can see how those go together. When we're learning about biochemical reactions, we're also going to talk about food webs. When we're learning about genetics and heredity, we're going to talk about genetic disorders and genetic engineering. So all of these things are going to go together. Okay, now 2 more things before I'm going to let you go because I know I've been yapping so much. 1, all my unit plans come with 50-minute and 90-minute pacing because I've taught in both scenarios. I've taught in a traditional every day, all year for 50-minute school. I've taught in a 90-minute AB every other day, all year school. And I've taught in a 90-minute every day, one semester school. So I've done all of those different options. And that makes my pacing much more informed than someone who's like just taught in a 50-minute classroom. And now they're just going to say, oh, just double it for 90. It doesn't work quite that way. And so that is going into all of those unit plans, all that's included. Plus, you get on grade level and honors resources, plus a 20+ page differentiation guide on top of that for further ways to simplify the on grade level resources and up level the honors resources to make them more advanced. And then last but not least is my packet strategy. I know that sounds so simple. It just sounds like making a bunch of copies, but there's paperless digital versions too. I'm just a paper girly. But I can't explain to you how much that organization helps students. You'd think that giving them more papers would make it more complex, but it doesn't because they put them right in their binders and then they don't have to worry about a textbook or all these different random handouts you've given them because it's all organized in one place in one binder. It is such a game changer for students. If you want to hear more about packets and that organizational strategy and why I'm obsessed with it, you need to check out episode 60 and I'll link that in the show notes for you. Okay. Here's your take-home challenge. If you have been interested in It's Not Rocket Science biology curriculum and you have a question about it, email me. I would love to help you. If you teach biology and want my pacing guide for more of a breakdown of my scope and sequence and exactly like what resources I'm teaching and what units, You can grab those at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/bio-guide. I'll link that in the show notes as well. Now, if you're listening to this and you don't teach biology, or you teach some other course, or you're teaching biology, but you don't want to do my sequence, you want to come up with your own, episode 80 of the podcast is my episode that helps you strategize your sequence. So check that out. You can find the show notes at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/episode 220. And if you have not left a review for the podcast, but you use It's Not Rocket Science biology curriculum, I would love to hear from you today. Leave a 5-star rating and write a review. It means so much to me to hear from you guys. All right, teacher friends, that wraps up today's episode. If you're looking for an easy way to start simplifying your life as a secondary science teacher, head to itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/challenge to grab your classroom reset challenge. And guess what? It's totally free. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you here next week. Until then, I'll be rooting for you, teacher friend.